I was married to Edward Kirkwood for 45 years, a marriage that was no longer a home, but a battlefield filled with bitter words and simmering resentment. Perhaps in the early years, there was love. But over time, that affection gave way to endless arguments, wounds that never healed, and invisible scars that burrowed deep into our souls. Even our children and grandchildren eventually drifted away, unable to bear the heavy atmosphere that clung to our house. On the last day of our lives, we were still fighting, our harsh voices echoing through 2 rooms separated by only 3 steps. Neither of us was willing to give in, not even a single word of apology. And so, we both died in loneliness, carrying silent hatred with us to our final breath. But death didn't close the book on our story. When we opened our eyes, we were horrified to realize we had traveled back in time. It was 1979 again. I was 20. Edward was 21. Before us stood the youthful, carefree versions of ourselves, 2 people so blindly in love, unaware that ahead of them was a lifetime of pain. We didn't need to speak. We knew exactly what had to be done: stop those 2 foolish kids before it was too late. We couldn't let another lifetime of suffering repeat itself. Without hesitation, we blindfolded and tied up our younger selves and dragged them to an abandoned warehouse, the place where our journey of reckoning would begin. There, we would confront the truth, peeling back every mistake that had buried our marriage over nearly half a century. Life had given us a second chance, and this time, we wouldn't let love turn into sorrow again. Inside that cold, empty warehouse, we, 2 people who had shared a lifetime of turmoil, stood staring at our younger selves with a bitter heartache. The 20-year-old girl, her face drenched in tears, looked as fragile as a wildflower caught in the rain. And the 21-year-old boy, his eyes filled with guilt and shame, still tried to shield her with his body despite being tied up. That scene cut through me like a knife, sharp with pain, sharper with anger. "They don't understand," I said through clenched teeth. "We have to make them see, if they marry, their lives will be destroyed." And so, we began to speak. I was the first to open up, my voice trembling as I recalled the year 1994, when our marriage had already collapsed into ruin. I had been laid off during a company reform, forced to make ends meet by selling bolts of cotton fabric outside the factory gates, dodging city officers while trying to hold on to the last shreds of my dignity. Then came that fateful day. The enforcers stormed the area wielding sticks. In a panic, I tried to flee, hauling my cart as fast as I could. In desperation, I screamed Edward's name, hoping he would come for me. But he didn't. When I finally looked up through the haze of dust, there he was, protecting Liliana, his ex-girlfriend, eyes wide with panic. I screamed again. But the only answer I got was silence, and a torn hand, after I was hit by a tricycle in my escape. "A stranger took me to the hospital," I said, my voice choking. And when Edward arrived, the first thing he said was, "I told you not to go out selling anymore. You only cause trouble." That sentence was the final blow. It shattered the last bit of trust one had left. I held up my scarred hand for the younger Edward to see. The mark had never faded, not even after all these years. The young Edward was silent, stunned. The older Edward lowered his head, his eyes brimming with tears. But I wasn't finished. I told them about the first 5 years after our wedding, when we didn't have children, and my mother-in-law, who had never accepted me, began to torment me mentally. She forced me to take traditional medicine, controlled every aspect of my life, and hurled cruel words at me day after day. Every single day felt like a form of torture. I once knelt in front of my father-in-law's memorial, praying for a child I knew I might never have. But I endured it all, because I believed Edward loved me. It wasn't until I collapsed from the effects of the herbs and had to be rushed to the hospital for poisoning that I learned the truth. Edward had whispered to his mother, "It's my fault. Don't tell Susan anything. I'm afraid she'll leave me." I covered my face, tears long dried but my heart breaking all over again. I should have left then and there, but I didn't. My story left both younger versions speechless. The young Edward trembled, his voice barely a whisper. If I were her, I would have left a long time ago. I met his eyes, my voice cold as ice. Then why didn't I, leave? Because of love. But love alone isn't enough to survive a marriage built on injustice. The air in the warehouse grew heavy with the weight of my words. No one spoke. The young Edward held Susan's hand tightly, his eyes filled with fear. The old Edward stood silent, his aged face soaked with tears. But that wasn't even the most painful part. I hadn't mentioned the liver yet. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to stay steady. When you were 40, you were diagnosed with end-stage liver cirrhosis. I cried all night holding the test results, overwhelmed by fear and despair. I was depressed, weak. The doctors advised me not to donate an organ. But I did it anyway. I looked straight at the older Edward, my voice sharp and unwavering. Do you remember? The day I came to the hospital to sign the liver donation form, I saw Liliana feeding you porridge, like she was your wife. She sat by your bedside, looking so gentle, so angelic. And I just stood there, frozen. A woman who had just decided to give up a part of herself to save her husband, watching that husband be cared for by another woman. I swallowed hard and continued. I couldn't take it. I snapped. I rushed forward and slapped Liliana across the face. I screamed at her, asked if she even knew what she was doing. I knocked the bowl to the ground, shards of the porcelain cutting my hand open. Blood poured out. And you, I turned to Edward, my voice shaking with fury. You didn't even look at me. You just rushed to wipe the stain off her dress. You turned to me, furious. Did you have to embarrass yourself like that? If you can't take it, then just get a divorce. That was the first time you ever mentioned divorce, not because I did something wrong, but because I had hurt Liliana. Young Susan fell silent. Young Edward kept his head down, unable to look at anyone. But I still wasn't finished. I didn't get a divorce, I said softly, because I had already signed the organ donation papers. And then I heard something from Liliana that nearly made me faint. I looked up at them. She said the entire scene at the hospital had been orchestrated by Edward. He told her to act that way, to provoke me, to make me angry enough to back out of the liver donation. He thought that if I hated him, I wouldn't go through with it. But I didn't hate him. I still went into surgery. And I lived on for many years after that, a sick, exhausted, and utterly lonely woman. I turned to the older Edward. You once said to me, you always use that liver donation to guilt-trip me. But do you know how much it hurt? Do you know I cried into my pillow every night, biting my lips to keep quiet, just so you wouldn't hear me? My voice began to tremble, and then one night, I heard you. Through the thin wall that separated our two rooms, I heard you whisper like a broken man, God, please let me take her pain. Please, take her sickness away, let me bear it instead. I paused, a tightness building in my chest. You, Edward Kirkwood, the man who never believed in anything but reason, prayed like a child. The warehouse was silent. No one moved. This wasn't just a story filled with blame anymore. It had become a confession, a revelation of long-buried truths, distorted love, and quiet sacrifices both of us had made, in all the wrong ways. I continued, my voice gentler. I didn't die because of our marriage. I died of cancer. But the thing that hurt me the most wasn't the dying. It was the moment I saw you, old, broken, drink pesticide just to follow me. I was already dead, and all I could do was scream, helpless, in the form of a ghost. You lay there, blood pouring from your eyes, nose, and ears, and I couldn't touch you. I couldn't stop you. My voice broke. That was the most painful moment of my life. Old Edward sobbed uncontrollably. Young Edward trembled, his voice choked. I didn't know. I didn't know it was all like this. I gave a sorrowful smile. Neither did I. I didn't know that love, even if it's real, could hurt someone so deeply. As I finished, old Edward began to cry. The tears he had suppressed for decades finally spilled over. His voice shook like a man burdened by a lifetime of guilt. Susan. I knew. I knew everything. I heard you crying through all those years. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to begin again. I looked at him, the man I once loved, once hated, and came to love again, and I realized that we hadn't failed because we didn't love each other. We failed because we didn't know how to love the right way. At the right time, Edward turned to look at his younger self, who was now overwhelmed by fear and confusion. His voice was thick with emotion. You asked why I told you not to marry? It's because I know exactly how cruel that road ahead will be if you enter marriage without readiness to sacrifice, to understand, and to forgive. Young Susan was silent, her eyes brimming. Young Edward bowed his head, then slowly asked, Do you regret it, marrying her? The question made both of us, me and the old Edward, freeze. It was a question we had avoided our entire lives. Old Edward closed his eyes for a long time before answering in a quiet, heavy voice, No. Despite the pain, the torment, no. Because if I hadn't married Susan, I would never have known what it means to love someone so much you'd be willing to die for them. He turned to me, voice sincere, Thank you, for giving me your liver. For not leaving me, no matter how terribly I treated you. I gave a faint smile, my eyes still wet. And do you know how many times I kept that divorce paper? Once, I wrote it and burned it. Once, I brought it to your door, then tucked it back into the drawer. Because every time I was about to walk away, I'd hear you coughing. I'd see your medicine untouched. I'd see you coming home in the cold wind, shoulders slumped. Young Edward gripped Susan's hand tightly, voice trembling. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to love someone that deeply. But if I know all of this now, I want to do it differently. The thing is, I interrupted, you can't change the past. But in the present, if you two truly want to live differently, then don't repeat our mistakes. Old Edward added, his eyes shining with feeling, and don't turn love into a battlefield. Don't let pride keep you silent. Don't let ego make you walk away. Marriage isn't about winning. It's about walking side by side. Young Susan still looked uncertain and asked, But, if I already know I can't have children, should I walk away now? I'm afraid I'll just be a burden. I softened my gaze and replied, I used to think the same. But the truth is, if a man is willing to walk through life with you, he won't leave you just because you can't bear children. If he truly wants to be a father, he'll find a way. But if he only wants you for the idea of being a mother, and not for who you are, then he's not the one to hold hands with for a lifetime. Old Edward nodded gently. When you died, I didn't just lose my wife. I lost my reason for living. All my past efforts, they weren't for success, or for Liliana, or even for the children. They were for you. When you were gone, I was a boat without a shore. His words silenced me. All these years, I thought I had been the one who suffered more, but now I saw, he had lived with half a soul torn away too. Young Susan then asked, her voice soft, So, if we do get married, and we know all the mistakes ahead of us, can we still avoid them? Young Edward held her hand tightly and said with conviction, We might not change the destination, but we'll choose a different road. Edward and I looked at each other, two weary souls, and we knew, these two young hearts may still suffer, but they had been given something we never had, a chance to see it all, before choosing, and maybe, just maybe, that's how time was healing us. Dawn was breaking. The first rays of sunlight slipped through the old wooden slats of the abandoned granary, casting a golden glow over 4 faces, 2 couples, 2 generations. But with the same heart beating at the crossroads of fate, old Edward suddenly jolted up, his cloudy eyes now wide open. He gently shook young Susan, who had dozed off after a long night of emotional turmoil. "Wake up. You have to go," he urged. "If you don't leave now, you'll miss the bus." Young Susan hesitated, her eyes lingering on young Edward. "But I still haven't decided." "It's okay," young Edward interrupted, his voice stronger than ever. "Just go first. I'll catch up. I promise." "What are you planning to do?" I asked, my voice low and cautious. Young Edward turned to me, his face calm and resolute. "I understand now. Love alone can't save a life if it's only a feeling. It needs preparation, courage. But if I can see a future filled with tears, and still want to hold her hand, then it means I'm ready to walk that path, just differently than you did." I was stunned. The boy who had once been lost in confusion now stood with unwavering strength. Young Susan burst into tears as she ran, glancing back, but young Edward didn't follow. He let her go, because this time, he wanted her to choose her own path, not for him, but because she deserved her freedom. I turned to old Edward, a trace of doubt in my eyes. "Do you think they'll be different from us?" He watched as young Susan disappeared into the sunlight, then replied with calm certainty, "They don't need to be different. They just need to learn from our mistakes." Suddenly, young Edward paused and turned back. "Sir, do you regret letting her suffer like that?" Old Edward fell silent for a long time, then slowly nodded. "Yes. But what I regret the most is not saying I'm sorry sooner." I looked at him, my throat tight. In that moment, all the bitterness faded, leaving only one truth: we had once loved each other. Truly. Then I looked at young Susan, the innocent girl who once was me, when I still had the courage to love someone without knowing what tomorrow would bring. Her eyes still lingered behind her, hoping he would come after her. Young Edward turned to us, saying, "Thank you. Without tonight, we might have always believed that love alone was enough." "No need for thanks," I replied with a faint smile. "Just live well. That's enough." And then, bathed in the brilliant light of morning, the silhouettes of the young couple faded around a bend, down a different road, no longer bound by old destinies. I turned to old Edward. His body, like mine, had begun to fade. Soft beams of light shimmered from our fingertips, our shoulders, our hearts, places once filled with pain, now cleansed by forgiveness. "We're disappearing," I whispered. He nodded, gently taking my hand, for the first time in years. "We've come full circle. Not to change the past, but to understand it," he said. I rested my head on his shoulder and softly asked, "If you could choose again, would you still marry me?" Edward smiled. "No. I'd never let you marry anyone else." We laughed, our laughter drifting into the wind, dissolving into the spreading light, and just before everything blurred away, I caught a glimpse of young Edward running, clutching his bus application tightly. His eyes were filled with hope. Maybe he would catch up to Susan. As for me and Edward, after a lifetime of arguments, resentment, and pain, we had finally let it all go. In that final moment, we were no longer two people who had failed. We were two souls who had learned to love, to forgive, and to let each other go. Everything blurred like a dream, dissolving into light. My body felt weightless, no longer burdened by age, illness, or sorrow, just stillness. Edward's hand was still in mine, rough, trembling, but inexplicably warm. In the fading space between us, we looked at each other in silence. No words were needed anymore. I whispered, "We lived a life full of pain, but also full of love, didn't we?" He smiled, his eyes shimmering. "Yes. And now, we finally get to rest." I nodded. No more bitterness. No more blame. In that final moment, I looked back on my life, the poverty, the anger, the betrayals, the scars, the nights of agony from cancer, but amidst it all, I still saw Edward, the clumsy, hard-headed man who had quietly loved me until the very end. Below, the sound of a bus hummed in the morning breeze. I caught a glimpse of young Susan by the window, holding her city application form, eyes determined but tinged with longing. In the distance, young Edward was sprinting toward the station, waving a white handkerchief, shouting her name once again. They chose each other, but this time, perhaps it would be different. Old Edward looked at me, lips trembling as if to say something. I tilted my head. What is it? He whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I wish I had cherished you sooner. I smiled, a light, forgiving smile. And I wish I had learned to speak my pain sooner. We fell silent. No more words were needed, and then, the light surged one final time, erasing every shape, every moment in time. Two worn souls, after a lifetime of struggle, were finally freed, finally at peace somewhere, in another place, in another time. Perhaps they will meet again, but this time not with hearts full of wounds, but as people who have learned how to love the right way. Years later, in the heart of the city, a gentle breeze swept through a small riverside street, where golden leaves drifted down beside the awning of a tiny cafe called Susan's Corner. The owner, a petite woman in her 30s with sharp yet warm eyes, was wiping down the outdoor tables. She was Susan Collins. A different Susan now, more mature, more independent, yet still carrying a softness in her gaze. Inside, the voice of a child rang out, "Dad. Mom said I'm not allowed to eat ice cream before dinner." Edward, now a calm, grounded man with ink stains still smudged on his hands from architectural drawings, stepped out from the back of the cafe, raising an eyebrow. "Then I'll eat it for you, okay?" He scooped the child up into his arms, then turned towards Susan, who pretended to scowl but couldn't hide the smile tugging at the corner of her lips. No one ever spoke of those painful days anymore. They had made different choices. No rushed marriage. No letting love cloud judgment. Susan pursued a career in education, worked part-time, and saved every penny to open her cafe. Edward started over in school, slowly becoming a structural engineer, and Liliana, she had left town, started a family far away. There was no bitterness between them, just distance and peace. One evening, Susan once asked Edward, "If one day we had to endure hardship again, like in those memories, would you still choose me?" Edward didn't answer right away. Instead, he simply squeezed her hand, tightly, as if to promise that if fate ever tested them again, he would still be there, and this time, he'd do better. On the highest shelf in the corner of the cafe sat an old photograph, an elderly couple standing beneath the autumn trees, hand in hand. Susan and Edward, older, long gone now, but their memory lived on, and thanks to them, a love that once failed, was given a second chance, this time, rewritten differently.